Okay, well, welcome to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host, and we start out another week together. And I thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to listen in to some of the thoughts and rantings, some people would say rantings, that I have. I trust that these things are things that are of interest to you. My effort in putting this whole thing together really was to imagine for a moment that I was sitting down in my office with someone across the way and having a conversation about a variety of things that have to do with faith, particularly. I do that a fair amount of time throughout this week. I've had a variety of conversations with students and other people alike about that faith. And inevitably, because I'm talking to humans, psychology comes into play. As I am known to say to my students over and over again, wherever humans are, psychology is. And I'm not talking about big P psychology, the stuff that we think of that is antagonistic to faith and very naturalistic and all of those sorts of things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of psychology that we are engaged in and day out, minute by minute, when we interact with people, when we interact with ourselves and how we see the world and all of that. And some of my efforts in talking about some of this material is really just to raise awareness of what reactions or thoughts come to mind for you when I'm talking about a particular topic. So the other thing is just talking about spiritual formation, and that's a fancy word for really what's our journey like? How do we do our journey? Are we looking for steps and ever increasing levels of intimacy with God, or what does it actually look like? I think for a lot of us, we probably feel like it's fairly messy along the way. And in a lot of ways, that is inevitable, given the fact that we are human. So the Psych Monologues is just those three things. The focal point varies from time to time, and I spend a lot of time gathering thoughts and information throughout the week that come to play and come to bear, I should say, with what I have to say each Sunday evening when I record these. So, and that's the Psych Monologue. It's a podcast that explores this intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. It allows maybe some questions to be asked, some issues to be poked at and highlighted that you wouldn't otherwise do. And that really is the purpose of me sitting down in front of this mic and wandering in my thoughts and my reactions for over a variety of topics. And this one today, I think, is really more key than most people give it credit. I honestly, I don't think we talk about it enough, to be real honest. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax, get your favorite beverage, hot or cold, whichever you prefer. And I want to try to talk about the things that really matter, and hopefully this one will, because this has been a question that I have touched on, poked at, ranted about for I don't know how long, really, honestly. And it's the issue of acceptance. And the question arises, why is it so hard for us to accept anything, really, other than, your winnings in the lotto? But why is it so hard to accept, particularly things that are distasteful to us? Accepting ourselves, for example, small topic, of course, or our faults, or the mistakes we make. Or here's a good one, accepting our needs. I mean, you can name it, and perhaps you're already going there. There are a variety of things that happen, that have happened today, that will happen tomorrow, that happen, and then you say that, well, that is, and you've heard people say it, right? Well, that is completely unacceptable. Okay. Then what's the alternative, really? I mean, what do we do instead of acceptance? And the interesting thing to me is that it seems like we are in a never-ending avoidance, a never-ending, I was going to say pursuit, but a pursuit of what? Avoidance of accepting anything. And there's got to be something there for us to avoid if it is so awful to accept something, particularly when it comes to us. Is this whole idea of acceptance is just anathema to us. And so what I want to do is try to flip the script here a little bit and start with, what do we do instead of acceptance? And then we'll flip it back again and get directly to the heart of this issue of acceptance, because the greatest weapon against self-condemnation and shame and anything related to that, is usually, it's always about acceptance. But whenever that topic comes up, it's like, well, is there any other thing that I could do? And I'm reminded of a story that I heard many, many years ago. A guy is climbing, rock climbing, loses his footing, and begins to tumble and grabs onto something, and it's a root or something that saves him. And and essentially, as we would all do in a situation like that, we'd start praying, right? God help me. And this particular person is hanging on by this root and essentially saying, God help me, please help me. And he hears a voice above him and it says, let go. And he said, you've got to be insane. You have got to be insane. Why would I want to do that? I'm hanging onto a root just to avoid letting go. He said, who in God's name, who is this? And the disturbing answer is, it's God. And he says, is there anyone else up there I can consult with? And that's us, isn't it? It's like we don't like really God's answer to dealing with ourselves. And the answer is distasteful to us. And so we look to other alternatives, other means, other methods to find a way to deal with this. And so the first thing is, what do we do instead of acceptance? And one of the first things that, as I think about this and all the hours and hours I've spent talking to people about it, there have been at least two different things that we do. First is denial. It's not that big of a deal. Other people do it, so we relativize it, we minimize it. We say that it didn't hurt anybody. It can be any number of things along that denial path. And it includes minimizing, it includes relativizing. You can add in, for good measure, rationalizing. Sometimes Christians fall into spiritualizing it. So there's a good spiritual reason for why I won't do this. And usually nobody is going to argue with us on that point. I mean, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we're all engaging in very much the same thing. And so when somebody else does it, we're not going to pull the mask away from them, because if we do that, we end up demasking ourselves or unmasking ourselves. We're not going to do that. So we're in this kind of silent collusion game of, I won't pull your mask if you don't pull mine. And that's very much a part of the alternative to acceptance, because it is so distasteful to us. So denial and distortion is very much a part of our repertoire when it comes to dealing with things we find distasteful about ourselves. Now, there's something that is haunting in the back of my head even as I'm talking about this, because in a lot of ways, we have a very distorted image of who we are and our worth, for that matter. And because of that, then, the conclusions we make is based on that distortion. And the distortion ends up being that we are forever lost and we will never get it right. And one of the biggest toxic things we buy into is comparing ourselves to someone else or comparing ourselves to some kind of ideal and say, well, I will never be enough, whatever enough is. And the reality is it's not enough of anything. It's just, it will continue to rise. As soon as we get close to it, it just rises. And that's the dirty little secret of enough thinking, if you will. And quite honestly, when it comes right down to it, it has nothing to do with enough at all. It has everything to do with acceptance, which brings me back to the subject of what we were going to talk about. So, but there's one other one that I want to talk about a little bit more, and that is something that looks like acceptance but isn't really acceptance. And it comes in the form of what we would call resignation. And the interesting thing about resignation is it looks almost identical to acceptance. I mean, in other words, it's giving up. And I had, like I said, I've talked to people for so long about this subject, and they give up. It's like, well, I'm not going to try anymore because it doesn't matter anyway. I'm never going to get it right. And it's just wrong. It's always going to be wrong. And no matter what I do, it will always turn out the same way. And that's one of the key characteristics of resignation, is that it precipitates a wait and see attitude, so that circumstances, external circumstances, or anything external to me has to change in order for me to move forward. So resignation, while looking like acceptance, is not acceptance at all. It's resignation. And the funny thing about it, which jumps ahead, but I'll jump back so you can just jump with me. The funny thing about it is that oftentimes when we engage in acceptance, it feels like resignation. But there's a quality between these two that I think is really very important. So let me jump back to resignation again. Because resignation, I mean, in AA language, a lot of times we will talk about hitting bottom. And it's like, I can't go any further. I have no resources left. I have nothing I can do. I've done everything that I can do to really jack things up. So this is just where I'm going to be. In psychology, we have this term called learned helplessness. And the interesting thing of how we discovered learned helplessness was an experiment with dogs. And the dogs were in kennels, and the floor of the kennels were mildly electrified, enough electrified to be uncomfortable, but it's not like a electric chair or anything like that. But it's enough to make it uncomfortable. And there was something very predictable that started to happen when they would turn on the electrical current to the floor of the kennel. And basically what would happen is the dog would dance and bark and dig on the sides of the kennel and wrap its teeth around there and try to break itself out and everything else. And it would do that for quite some time. But eventually, it would start to do less and less of it, and then eventually it would stop, and you would think it would just stop. It would just wait, because it's nothing that it does is going to make any difference at all. But instead, what they found was that some dogs literally would show a helplessness, and they would basically lay down on their side, exposing the entire surface area of their side of their body to the electrical current. And you look at that and say, wait a minute, I mean, that's making it worse. I mean, the paws of their feet are far less surface area of their body than the entire side of their body. Why are they doing that? The even more interesting thing is they turn the electricity off, pull the door open, and they can't get the dog out. It won't come out. That's the profound power of learned helplessness. And that's what resignation does to us. Now, the thing about that is that when I engage in resignation, I can at least not fail. I cut my losses, right? Because if I don't act, I can't fail, which I'm already predicting is what will happen. And if I can't fail, then I'm not a failure. And I just wait. I just wait for something to happen, basically. And even if it does happen, the worst part about it, particularly with us humans, is we think it all out and calculate it all out and say, even if I tried, it would not turn out because I've already taken in and drawn a belief that even if I try, it won't turn out anyway, so why bother? Now, resignation leads to inactivity, and it leads to, on the positive side, it leads to cutting the amount of losses that we feel like we've already experienced. So, and the interesting thing about this that I've seen, and listen, I say this because I've been down this road so many times myself, is that I look back on my spiritual journey, and there are a variety of behaviors and things like that I've tried to overcome, and I can't seem to get anywhere, and then I just quit and say, I'm done. I just quit. I'm not doing it anymore. Now, that doesn't mean I stop acting. I still live life and I do things, but each time I say I'm done, it adds another kind of nail to that coffin that I am helpless, I am powerless, and no matter what I do, it will not make any difference at all. And so on the outside, people say, well, look, he seems to have adapted to, this very distasteful situation he's in. But it's not that at all. It's not an adaptation. Actually, it's a revolt, but it's a revolt in passivity. And that's what resignation gets us. So what is the opposite of acceptance oftentimes is resignation. The beauty of it is it looks like acceptance. It looks like acceptance. And so resignation waits, and it predicts a catastrophic future no matter what is done. So the second thing, and this is kind of the major component that I would make a pitch for, is the whole idea of acceptance. Now, why, going back to my first question, why is it so hard for us to accept anything? Things about ourselves, our needs in particular. And the short answer is acceptance leaves me vulnerable and feeling weak. And so why would I want to accept anything? Because it contributes to me making those conclusions and feeling that way. The other thing that I see over and over again, and I actually have had people ask me this even within the last week, when we talk about acceptance and accepting other people, even when they make all the wrong decisions, the interesting thing is they are convinced that if they accept them, they are now condoning their behavior and they will not change. Now, the devil's advocate in me is, who died and left you in charge of their behavior change? I'm sorry. That's a tall order. That's a big responsibility Forget about the fact that you have no power to even make that happen. And see, what we do is we withhold our acceptance as a means of trying to change somebody. And I would suggest to you that is not acceptance at all. It's manipulation. Nothing more. That's it. And so we have come to believe that if I accept anything about myself, I am dooming myself to never change. To never change. Now, if that were the case, and I put this to y'all in all honesty, if that were the case, and we have done all the other things that I've said, resignation or denial or distortion or minimizing or relativizing or rationalizing or any other izing thing you want to come up with, how has that worked? Has it actually accomplished what you thought it was going to accomplish? Because ultimately, if we're honest, we will say, I just end up in the same old cycle over and over and over again. And there's a way to break out of it, but it requires us doing something that is so repulsive to us because it engages us and pushes us toward coming face to face with our limits, our weaknesses, our flaws, our shortcomings, our inability, our insecurities. Oh, that sounds like a fun idea. Let's do that. So why would I want to do acceptance? Acceptance doesn't make any sense. It just, no, I'm not going to do that. And I can tell you, particularly the wonderful perfectionists that are out there listening to me, acceptance is anathema to your very existence. Because we've convinced ourselves, and I use the plural because I'm in this too, we have convinced ourselves that nothing short of perfection will lead to any sort of optimal performance. The funny thing about it is all the research, even if you want to play that card, all the research points to that actually contributes suboptimal performance. Demanding perfection. Now, I mean perfection in the truest sense of the term. I'm not talking about excellence. There's a difference here from perfection. Because perfection is really riding shotgun with shame. And perfection is one of the most damaging things, particularly to people who are high achievers, driven, wanting to get a lot of things done, except nothing short of perfection, and they never reach it. And the alternative is what? Is failure. So now I will pursue perfection in order to avoid failure. And I can't reach one, and I already assume the other. Talk about caught between a rock and a hard place. So what about acceptance? What about it could possibly be compelling enough to even consider doing it? Excuse me. Well, the thing that we don't see is something that I say a lot of, and that is, I cannot change that which I won't accept. Now think about it, right? I mean, if for example, I have this is an extreme example, but let's go with it. I twist my ankle terribly, and I've done this in the past because I've really butchered the ligaments surrounding my ankle from playing basketball for so long, and I've twisted my ankle really badly, and it hurts a heck of a lot. And I say, I'm fine. I'm just going to go through it. It's not that bad. See, this is the funny kind of tool that we use, right, to engage in denial, is we just simply say, it's not that bad. Compared to what? A severed foot? So that the whole idea of changing, rehabilitating my ankle, making changes, maybe sitting out and not being able to play for a while, that's the trade. But the only way I am going to make any change is that I accept the reality of what is actually happening. Now, oftentimes, the only way that we will take in or embrace acceptance is when it is so incontrovertible, so overwhelming, so compelling, and stops us dead in our tracks, that then we say, okay, well, I guess I accept the fact that I've got COVID, for example. I've got a fever, and the idiotic little test says I'm positive. All of that, okay? Or, as in my previous example, I accept the fact that I have a very badly sprained ankle. It needs rehab, being immobilized, having, ice and warmth, all the usual treatments, and get some rehab to strengthen that thing up. I don't need to strengthen it if I don't have a problem. And so in the physical world, we're more than willing to accept that to be the case. In the emotional, psychological, even spiritual world, I don't think we buy that. Because acceptance is waving the white flag. It's saying, essentially, we have equated to accepting something to resignation, right? But I want to make a suggestion here, is that acceptance has nothing to do with resignation. It has everything to do with engaging and embracing what is. Just reality. And the funny thing about it is reality's, you would think that that's easy. In the physical world, yeah, it is. I mean, we're all fairly cognizant and respectful of gravity. We all know that, and we accept it. But there are some things in our world, particularly in this kind of squishy, undefined, intangible world of emotions and thoughts and all the other things, that we can just simply box it up, put it away, and forget that it ever existed. I mean, the funny thing about it is when we do that and that proverbial box is put away, we forget about the fact that sooner or later it will start leaking, and it will leak into everything else in our lives. And to get an example of that, which would be going back way back in the archives of the Psych Monologues, was virtually my second episode, episode number 2, and it was called Love Canal. And that's an example. I would suggest you go back and listen to it. It's all the way back in March, April 2020. So for acceptance to accomplish what we desire, not for it to do, because we're not so sure that we buy this whole idea, but acceptance engages and embraces reality as it is. And then, and only then, do we start to make some legitimate progress toward doing something different. Or, even more so, reorienting how we see things. Because a lot of times we have to figure out how to reorient our thoughts, moving from learned helplessness to I can be an agent in my world and have an impact. And part of that reorienting of our thoughts is that I accept the design, and I accept the reality that I am broken and I am sinful. I miss the mark every time from what God wants for me. I accept that. Does that mean I'm condoning it? No, it isn't. But we equate it that way. And because we do, we never accept it. And we keep working on it as if it will change, but we haven't even bothered to accept it. You know, one of the hardest steps in the 12-step program, and 12-step program plays a legitimate role in the process of recovery for millions of people. But most will tell you the hardest step is the first step, because it's the step of acceptance, of being out of control and needing help. So one of the other things that I mentioned earlier about acceptance that we have particularly hard time with is our own needs. And the way that we don't accept it is we equate our needs with being needy. And therefore we are weak, therefore we are limited, therefore we're a bunch of losers, and we deserve what we get. And see, these narratives we're not even conscious of. We don't even see, it's a speeding Mack truck and we don't even see it. And when it hits us, it's like, where'd that come from? But we've been thinking it all the time. We've been thinking it almost continuously. Every time I make a mistake or put my foot in my mouth or say something I wish I hadn't, which is kind of the same thing. Or anything. We beat ourselves up and proclaim it unacceptable and then go on and keep doing the same thing. It doesn't make sense, right? But I think that is the anatomy of the cycle we find ourselves falling into. And then what we do is we take out the really big hammer of shame and say, if you weren't such a loser, you wouldn't do this stuff and try not to be a loser. And that's being motivated by shame leaves us in the same cycle. Because for a while, we might be actually able to carry it off. We might actually be able to do it. But we run out of gas, and life hits, and crap hits, and we feel helpless to do anything about it, or we are helpless to do anything about it, and we don't want to admit the fact that we're helpless, or we might need some help. And so acceptance engages and embraces reality as it really is, and then can survey the landscape for what exactly do I need, and then seek out the necessary resources available to me to make the changes I want to make. Not grandiose, Grand Canyon-sized changes, just small little changes that actually can lead to larger and larger things. And that includes what we do with God. It does. Because our lack of acceptance, I think, is directly related to us saying to God, thank you for saving me. Thanks for the grace for doing all that. But I'll take it from here. I'll work my butt off to the very end to prove that indeed I am worthy of the grace that you have showered on me. And that's also one of the reasons why grace is such a stumbling block for many of us. Because it takes acceptance, namely self-acceptance, to be able to absorb and embrace and actually grow in the context of grace, because we are the least gracious people with ourselves, and everybody will say it. We've got a different way of saying it. You know, I'm my own worst enemy is one of the easiest ones that everybody can think of. I'm my own worst critic. Yep, you sure are. Because you know exactly the places to criticize yourself where you have no answer. Other than, it's not about my worth. My worth has already been established. And I may not, that sounds easy. I know it isn't. But if I can find a way to decouple my worth from my performance, another way to put it is decouple my person from my performance, then actually one is safe and secure in the grace that I'm given in Christ and in my relationship with him. So now what? Now I have the capacity to actually make the kind of changes that I seek to do, because I want to bring what I do in alignment with who I am. And that's what is so hard, and that's why acceptance is so critical. So I know that when I do or say stuff like this, there's somebody out there listening to me and say, okay, that's great, Mitch. But how? How do you do it? But then the only way I can answer that question is that if I give you the 12 finest steps to come to self-acceptance, and you do them to perfection, I might add, where does that leave us? Back in the same boat we were in the very beginning. So we end up, the very tools we use to try to embrace acceptance is the same tools that got us to the place of non-acceptance. So what's the alternative? Well, it's not. I'd be the first to say it's not terribly pleasant. But if I can embrace, and here comes the word, accept what I've been given and act as if it is true. I'm not saying believe it, because we don't just flip a switch and start believing something. I hear people say that all the time, and we just don't. So let's not fool ourselves or talk as if that's true. It isn't. But imagine for a moment, just imagine for a moment, if tomorrow morning when you got up, you were to act as if you were God's beloved all day tomorrow. What would be different? How would you treat yourself? And I'd start there. I wouldn't start with somebody else. And that's not me saying, oh, be self-absorbed for the entire day. Because that's the mistake we make. We end up arguing from an extreme position. No, it's starting with myself, being kind to myself, being gracious with myself. And if you fall into the trap of thinking, well, then I'm cutting myself slack and I won't ever do anything. Well, maybe, and because if I have the freedom to fail, I also have the freedom to succeed. But if I deny myself the freedom to fail, I rarely will succeed at the level that I think I should. And so there's so much entangling in here. Acceptance isn't something that we just put it on our to-do list for tomorrow and I'm going to accomplish this tomorrow. I think it starts somewhere with starting to take apart and at least catching ourselves in action when we start beating the living daylights out of ourselves because we said something wrong. That's where to start. It's like saying I'm human, not using it as a foil to get out of responsibility, but saying it as a reality that I live within, and I live within the limits of that. And it's not pleasant to be human. I don't like the limits I live within, but I'm willing to accept that and then live in trust that God and Jesus will actually carry me to the conclusion that they desire, becoming more like Jesus, because I'm working toward aligning more and more of my thought life and my behavior in line with the way that he describes how life is best lived. And I'll never get it right. Doesn't that sound hopeful? I'll never get it right, but I will certainly get a lot closer if I choose that path than taking the path of I must, I have to, I should, and if I don't, I'm a failure and therefore I'm a loser. And it takes a lot of practice. I am not saying all these things as if I've arrived and I'm able to do that. That is a daily, evening reminder session that I have with myself about it. And I do it in a variety of ways. Most times for me, it's journaling. And journaling isn't meant to be, an attempt at sounding like Ernest Hemingway in my journal. It's an attempt to be honest and raw and unedited and pull up a chair, sit down across the table from my Abba and say, this is what the day has been like, and this has really been tough. And there are things that I think, that I do, that I consider, that I really, I'm pretty embarrassed about. And I'm sure some of those things were really not very pleasing to you. As a matter of fact, I'm so convinced of that they actually created distance between us, and that worries me, and I need to talk further about that. See, that's a conversation with a friend, not an enemy, not a judge, not somebody that is saying, I'm just waiting to count up all the demerits of the day so I can blast you with shame. No, that doesn't work that way. And all you have to do, and this is my final point, I know I'm running longer than I usually do, but I would remind you of one thing, because a lot of people do know that Peter denied Jesus, betrayed Jesus 3 different times. And he didn't do it just in anonymity. He did it, and Jesus knew, because their eyes locked on one another. And the sign was all it took of the crow cawing to say, yeah, he was right. I really am. No, not I really am. I really did betray him. But there's this interesting conversation on the shores of Galilee. And Peter and his friends are out they went back to doing what they've always done, and that's fish. And went out fishing, because it's like, well, he's gone. I don't know what else to do, but to fish, I know how to do that, and maybe that'll make a living and allow us to live. And they're out there, and they're doing their thing, and they see a lone figure on the beach, and they see a fire come to life. And as they drift and look, and Peter is particularly curious about this, and he looks, and the figure turns in a particular way, and he recognizes the silhouette, and he recognizes who it is. And he strips off his clothes and jumps into the water, charging toward Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. And there's a fire and fish on the fire, and he invites them to come and share breakfast again, which is interesting because his last meal with them was a supper. He has them have breakfast, and they go for a little walk. And the funny thing about that walk, if you look at it very carefully, is there's somebody shadowing Jesus and Peter as they're walking along the beach. And I don't know how close he was or he wasn't, but as they walk, I challenge you to look at that conversation very carefully. Because Jesus did not say to Peter, you know what you did, right? You know what you did. So what are you going to do to fix it? This is a mess. You betrayed me 3 different times. What are you going to do? He said no such thing. He asked one simple question. Do you love me? Do you love me? And I think that's a telltale. That is a telltale for what Jesus wants in his relationship with us. To pursue love instead of avoiding shame. And trusting the rest of that process. Everyone's process is going to be different. Everybody's process is going to be different. It has to be, because it's your history, it's your story, it's your journey. But the key is pursuing love, not avoiding shame. Avoiding shame doesn't change behavior. Looks good for a while, but it doesn't change behavior. So, where do we land? Well, I'd simply say resignation waits and acceptance engages and embraces reality as it is. It's willing to do that in service to bringing things in alignment for what we desire in our relationship with Jesus, and from that relationship, other relationships are impacted. The more I recognize my need for grace, the more it begins to come out of me. And I communicate that. See, we got to reverse. We got to communicate it to everyone else and condemn ourselves internally. And we're always going to run out of gas with that process. We're human. Here it is again. We're limited. We don't have inexhaustible supplies. But grace is something very different. It's an amazing commodity, if you want to think of it that way, that just keeps growing with use and with acceptance. So there you have it. And that's it for tonight. I just want to remind you of a few things. I always do it at the end of every podcast. If you have questions, if I hit a button that has you thinking or has you wrestling with something, DM me your question on Instagram. I'll respond. I've got people that are doing that work for me. I don't spend a lot of time on the social media platforms. I know how important they are to keep us connected technology-wise. At the same time, it's a dangerous territory to be in, and I understand that, so I spend very little time. I don't do that to the people that are helping me with this project either, but it's a way for us to communicate, and on that point, it's helpful. And so DM me your questions if you have any or reactions to what I've said tonight. And subscribe to us on any of the platforms that we can be found on. That would be Instagram at the Psych Monologues, or Facebook, ray.mitch, M-I-T-S-C-H, or LinkedIn, Dr. Mitch is there. And so subscribe on the social media, subscribe to the Psych Monologues on Spotify or Stitcher or iTunes or wherever that might be. And if there's anything that you listen and hear and you like, put up a review. That's the only way that people are going to find this podcast, if it's helpful in any way, shape, or form. And then on the podcast, or on my website at drmitch.com, we've got a blog, and there's going to be some upcoming new material showing up on the blog. It'll be of great interest to you, I'm sure. It'll be on various topics. I've got various people lined up to start writing in it, and I think it will be of interest, because overall the purpose behind all the things that I'm doing is really to be the voice for and a voice to the next generation of Christians, young Christians that are fleeing the church. And that's why I keep doing this, really. So the other thing is if you're interested in partnering with us to grow our scholarship fund for the silent retreats we put on every year, 2 a year, 3 a year, sometimes. This year it's going to be 3. And that also can be used to make it affordable for students and then alumni that are just getting started in their jobs to be able to participate in a silent retreat. It's something that I've been doing for 13 years now, and it is a profound impact, I think, generally on people that take the opportunity and actually engage it and do it. And you can sign up right there on the website under CCU and silent retreats. There's a sign up registration, and if in doubt, sign up and register. And if we can get you in, we will. If we can't, then we'll understand what our need is to do more. So you can contribute by hitting the Donate Now button on the first page of the website, or at the page for the silent retreats. Or if you'd rather contribute through check, you can do that as well. Just make checks out to 1615.tv. It should be the same on the address. If you send it by snail mail, and that would be 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104. Well, it's been a delight. I appreciate you taking the time, as I said at the beginning, to sit down and have this time together. I know it's not a dialogue, but it is in my mind as we're sitting and talking about the things that are really ultimately important to your spiritual journey, your personal journey, and hopefully it will be encouraging and useful and maybe even challenging. So thanks so much for joining me, and as always, love ya. Later. Bye.